is it's the second version of a paper written about 1.5 years ago. It was commissioned. I was asked to contribute to a volume, an edited volume on the theme of the human, but the contribution had to be very short. There was a 3,000 word limit on it. Anyway, so I wrote kind of a text which was actually longer, about more than 3,000 words. I sent an edited version of that to this volume, to the editor for this volume, which I'm not sure when it will be out, but it should be out at some point. It has the same title as this talk, or as this paper, but I reworked it quite considerably in the intervening year. So this is a second draft of this, it was prompted by, well, look, I mean, it's really prompted by debates about the status of the human in contemporary philosophy, but also, contemporary philosophy, critical theory, and the humanities more generally. And obviously, the emergence of debates around, post-humanism, so it begins with a kind of a critical look at, at this post-human, or at least one kind of influential strain of post-humanism. I know that there's more than one, and in a way, part of the, I'm not entirely satisfied with the paper because it only deals with a kind of one strand. However, I mean, the paper was written as a kind of, as a survey. So it begins as a kind of it's an attempt to kind of, to diagnose the underlying philosophical stakes of the crisis of the human, the crisis, the interrogation of the status of the human and of humanism, which has actually been ongoing for at least 50 years. It's not a new development. I mean, already, Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault are all kind of critics of what they call, humanism. And in a way, it's part of the paper is an attempt to kind of, to do a critical genealogy of, contemporary post-humanism, but also to, to mark the shifts, the discontinuities, how this, the brand of post-humanism, which seems to be kind of ascendant in the humanities and social sciences, is significantly different from the versions, from the critiques of metaphysical humanism proposed by a figure like Derrida, which is why, and he plays, a significant role in this text. The second section is an examination of his, the ends of man, which is itself a kind of a critical dialogue with Heidegger. And look, the point, in a way, my kind of diagnosis, or my hunch, a philosopher who first paradigmatically seeks to displace humanism and anthropocentrism in the post-Kantian European tradition is Heidegger. Okay, so I think all the critiques, the post-structuralist critiques of humanism, are have a kind of a complex tributary relation to Heidegger's kind of critique of humanism. In a sense, even a figure like Althusser, although he's by no means a Heideggerian, but even Althusser's kind of rejection of what he calls humanism, which he identifies with a kind of a philosophical anthropology which sees man as the subject of history, and Althusser's text on humanism give this kind of humanism is the claim that history is a process with a subject, and that subject is like self-consciousness or Geist in the idealist tradition, and it's labor in the kind of the initial Marxist tradition. And in a way, it's the destitution of the subject and the destitution of kind of self-consciousness in the kind of the Hegelian and post-Hegelian tradition, which is Heidegger's kind of crucial gesture, which sets the stage for the the attempts to kind of to somehow to move beyond humanism in 60s French philosophy. So and I think I think Derrida's in a way, I found Derrida's in a way the most interesting and the most sophisticated critical engagement, precisely because he's profoundly indebted to Heidegger, but also there are points when he kind of seems to query certain Heidegger's claims about humanism's humanism's connection to the metaphysics of the subject. Okay, and look, also like the point I make, the point is that I really think that Heidegger's project and Heidegger's philosophical legacy is a direct kind of rebuttal or rejection of the line that leads from Hegel to Marx, okay, which is why Marx is the kind of attacks on in these debates about the human and humanism. It's Marx who is a kind of fundamentally interpolated, and I think that the attempts to align anti-human, post-humanism as it's called, anti-humanism is the Althussergian kind of moniker, but in a way the attempt to kind of to align post-humanism with emancipatory politics, I think that this kind of alliance is rooted in a confusion and equivocation, which is actually dangerous. So that's why I was trying to interrogate the conditions under which the category of human, or in a way, the reduction of the human to a category, to something like a metaphysical category, becomes the condition for kind of a gesture that proclaims itself as emancipatory, and that's what I was trying to kind of examine and call into question in the text, by suggesting that ultimately the kind of that Marx's relationship to Hegel and Marx's kind of critique of Hegel is a kind of an ineluctable philosophical condition for understanding the horizon of emancipatory politics. In other words, I think, and the connection with last week is that all these you ontologize. It's a rejection of political ontology, of the ontologization of politics, which is the other gesture that I see, kind of, which is kind of, proclaimed in a sophisticated form in Deleuze and Guattari. The ontologization of ethics is also the ontologization of politics, and I think that that's reinscribing of emancipatory politics into this frame of ontological naturalism is really problematic, and that's what the paper is, critically examining. But it seems to me that Marx's whole point is the kind of is a systematic kind of rejection of every naturalization, and Derrida is particularly interesting because he himself is very kind of sensitive to these questions about the political valences of naturalization. But what's weird is how, he also, I think, uncritically, he mortgages his own kind of deconstructive project to these kind of, to this Heideggerian premise about, the reactivation of the question of being. I think my point is that if you kind of, if you kind of try to purge the question of being of its Heideggerian kind of residues, as arguably kind of Derrida is trying to do and with deconstruction, turning it into, you know, a kind of a concern with, you know, alterity and, you know, there's nothing left of being and of ontology. And then it seems to me that you have to go back to kind of this post-Hegelian tradition, especially the kind of the Marx-Hegel tradition, to understand why, you know, the questions, you know, why Marx, you know, puts, you know, the question of social form and social practice at the heart of both, you know, epistemological questions about meaning and of objectivation, but also of any, you know, concern with human emancipation. So yeah, so that's basically what the paper is about. But I'm reworking it actually because there's a couple of things I'm not satisfied. I'm unsatisfied by. So I'm actually yes, in the process of reworking it. And it will be part of a book that I'm working on.
Thank you
so
so
yeah,
much.
so that's a basic overview of the how the paper came to be written.
So I have a question. Is my voice okay, by the way? I'm unsure.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So you have talked about this, the ontologization of politics on several occasions throughout your whole philosophical life, I guess. What I don't quite understand and what I wanted to ask is this. So what issue do you see with this move? Also, I mean, is it sort of this, you know, destruction of the is out gap? So is that exactly your argument, or is it also, is this also the case? Is your disliking also the case for the ontologization of politics? Sorry, politicization of ontology, vice versa. And is, you know, the Deleuze and Guattari's project in Capitalism and Schizophrenia a case of politicization of ontology?
Okay, there's two. You just distinguished two kind of, you know, two articulations. One, the ontologization of politics, which I think is something that Deleuze and Guattari kind of, you know, undertake, you know, quite explicitly, but also the politicization of ontology. Okay, so in there, and they say, like, I think in somewhere in 1,000 Platos, every ontology is political. You can't, the political and the ontological are woven together. Now, the question is obviously, if you know, explicitly, self-consciously kind of, you know, ontologize politics, then it stands to reason that you will politicize ontology. So ontological disputes become politicized, okay? But then in a way that's, you know, it's the first that a Marxist, okay, or any critical theorist can happily kind of, you know, accept the second articulation, say, yes, of course, every ontology is political, but that's precisely because it is, you know, freighted with kind of substantive kind of, you know, normative or categorical assumptions, which are socially and historically kind of determined. But the gesture of, so I want to reject the ontologization of politics, because in a way I also think ontology, the philosophical discourse of ontology, is in a way is not possible actually, and in Heidegger reactivates ontology with the question of the meaning of being. And I see the kind of the critical gesture as being the decoupling of, meaning and being, or Kant's critical gesture saying that, meaning is not part of, or meaning can't be, simply, excavated from, or kind of, retrieved from an account of being, of what is. Now, it's different. Of course, you can say then that any account of what is, presupposes meaning, presupposes kind of, semantic, normative categories. And in a way, like that's a philosopher like Sellers will kind of say something like this. But to say that to understand what is presupposes, a horizon of sense and a kind of certain normative structures, conditions of intelligibility, which are indispensable, doesn't mean that you can therefore kind of, that what is or being as such determines or generates intelligibility. That's the claim I have a problem with, okay? And it's so it's one thing to kind of, to bring out, the latent political presuppositions and political implications of different ontologies. But I think to do that, or to do that properly, you should refuse the, the ontologization of politics. And the reason why I think that actually Adorno has the best critique, I think, of this, of the ontological discourse, of the resurgence of ontological discourse. And it's in his essay on, the idea of natural history in the 30s, where he says that, by nature, I mean what contemporary ontologists call being. In a way, you could say that, like, every ontology is a naturalization because because nature is simply what is. Okay, it's not a kind of a specific object domain. It doesn't have a kind of, the most kind of, general and abstract definition of nature you can give is simply is that what is, okay? And this is why, capital, social structures become oppressive and pernicious to the extent that they are taken as they are naturalized, they're taken as second nature. And it's the fact, in a way, it's really the articulation of, mystification is the presentation of something made as something given, substituting, or, or presenting the made as something given. And that's the gesture that Marx is always kind of denouncing. And in a way, that's what, any, I guess, a kind of a philosophical discourse that is informed kind of by Marxian critique, in a way entails a suspicion. Once you, if you simply kind of say, well, nature is in the kind of in a generic philosophical sense is a domain of what is, then it means that not that you can disregard what is, simply ignore it, but understand how its substantive characterization is never innocent. The point is that kind of, there's no kind of, originally unmediated relation to nature. There's no kind of intuition, pure intuition of the structure of nature or the qualities and properties of natural phenomena. That means that, you know, what we know of nature, how we understand nature, is always kind of, you know, mediated. And yes, that's what, and it's this kind of insistence on this critical negotiation with anything that presents itself as a kind of, you know, as nature or as natural. Okay, is that a kind of a response?
Yeah, that was a very elaborate response, and I'm thankful for it.
Okay.
I could ask a question.
Sure.
So I just wanted to ask you, and hi again, Ray.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask you. I know you've written a little bit about, you know, Son Rethel's notion of real abstraction. You've touched on it a little bit, and I guess you have some precedent for this engagement going back to even the Speculative Realist Conference of 2007, where Alberto Toscano was moderating, for example. But, you know, I think it's interesting in Intellectual and Manual Labor, because in that text, Son Rethel writes a little bit about Hegel, and he says that, you know, in a way, Hegel's dialectics can only function as a kind of social mystification because of the way that Kantian dualism is a consequence of the structure of the commodity form, right, which sort of grips the structure of social reality. And I wonder, you know, if you think of, I'm thinking about, you know, certain forms of I guess what's called neo-rationalism, like Nigristani's notion of the inhuman, which is not, as he says, it's decidedly not the anti-human, right? It's a way of working within, I think, a context of discussing human commitments without reifying, right, what the human is. But I'm wondering if, in a way, you know, if you look at Hegelian thought, right? You know, I think in a sense, and this actually, it's interesting in the piece The Ends of Man, because Derrida discusses this, and he discusses how, in a sense, there's, if I understand it correctly, in a sense, there's still a sort of originary status which is ascribed to the human in Hegel's system, but then it's codified, right, through the phenomenology, and he draws an analogy with Husserl, I think, and then acquires a different kind of expression in the logic, right, which isn't reducible to phenomenology. But I wonder if you see there as being a contradiction between, for instance, the program of someone like Son Rethel, who tries to set out the way that, if I understand it properly, thinking from the standpoint of the human, or presupposing, you know, reason or consciousness as the basis of reality, right, is already conditioned by the commodity form in a certain sense. And I'm wondering if you see, or if you think there could be a possible tension between that and something like the notion of the human as inhuman, as it's been defined by Nigristani, for example.
Okay. I'm very interested in Son Rethel, and I want to write a chapter of this book will be on, you know, the his work and his account of real abstraction. It strikes me, I'm still trying to figure out, you know, where, you know, where I agree and disagree with his analysis, but I think there is it seems to me that there is a worry in Son Rethel's account, and precisely it's about his Kantianism, his kind of, you know, the fact that he is a kind of a Kantian Marxist as opposed to a Hegelian Marxist. The question is whether, you know, everything hinges on the exchange abstraction. Is exchange the condition of real abstraction, or is real abstraction already the condition for exchange? And I think that there's an issue with Son Rethel about the role of abstract labor in, you know, understanding exchange. And one, I'm not sure about this, but kind of one worry in kind of Son Rethel's account is that it seems, Marx writes in the Grundrisse that labor itself is a real abstraction, okay? And he says it's only in a kind of, in capital, in a society, kind of a society kind of a certain kind of complexity and with a kind of a determinate structure, that's in a way something that has always been, social reproduction involves kind of labor. But in a way, labor only becomes a kind of a category, a fundamental kind of category of social self-understanding under capitalism. And that's because labor itself has become a real abstraction. Labor, as condition for social existence for a majority of the population, it becomes a kind of the site of social reproduction. And that means, therefore, that the abstraction, that's the distinction between exchange value and use value in the commodity form, okay, is in one sense, indissociably linked to the distinction between concrete and abstract labor. And as I understand Marx is not saying that concrete labor, first you have concrete labor and then you have abstract labor. No, just as use and exchange are the two indissociable facets of the commodity form, okay? It's not as if you use commodities and then they become, that use is abstracted into exchange. Use and exchange are the two sides of the commodity. So labor is simultaneously concrete and abstract in capital. So labor as real abstraction is at once concrete and abstract. Okay, it has a use value and an exchange value. And that's the condition for the extraction of surplus value. It's through the capitalist consumption of the wage laborer's concrete labor. Labor is exchanged abstractly but consumed concretely, and it's through this kind of discrepancy between concrete and abstract that surplus value is extracted. But this happens, labor is exchanged in the sphere of those two kind of it happens in labor is consumed in the sphere of production, whereas it's bought and sold in the sphere of exchange. And I think that means that you can't simply establish exchange itself as the source of real abstraction, understood as the kind of, the dissociation of quantity from quality, okay, or of homogeneous kind of, quantity from heterogeneous quality. And it seems to me there's a problem, because in Sohnrettel's account, it's almost as if the risk is always that he reinstates, a pre-Hegelian opposition between the concrete and the abstract, as if you have concrete use values, you have concrete labor and concrete use values, okay, and then all of a sudden, then you get abstraction, an abstraction from the concrete, which is a completely kind of undialectical and pre-Hegelian understanding of the difference between the abstract and the concrete, and one which I think is simply not Marxian. And that also is why there's a weird kind of ahistoricity to Sohnrettel's account of the exchange abstraction. He projects it back to the exchange abstraction begins with money, with coin, which is why intellectual abstraction, through the division of intellectual and manual labor, you get the kind of abstract kind of philosophical category come into play with the coin form. And I think that methodologically that analysis is dysfunctional. It doesn't, precisely because of the interdependence of all these kinds of the commodity form, the value form, exchange use value, and labor as such in Marx's analysis. Okay, so I think that's why it's implausible to see exchange itself as the source of real abstraction. For Marx, real abstraction is consequence of a system of, the capital relation, and a system of social relations. And those social relations are both, conditioned by and conditioning of real abstraction. So I think Sohnrettel's account is too unilinear and weirdly, actually, you could almost say anachronistic, in which it kind of, it takes the structure of the commodity form to be already operative in coinage, okay? Whereas money says that kind of, money and commodities are merely two aspects of value, okay? They're kind of manifestations of value, and value itself, implies the capital relation. So you can't take the commodity form, extract it from the capital relation, and put it back in, and then see it as a kind of, as a source of real abstraction, I think. So now there's others, I mean, that's a bit, I think, so in a way, that's why I see the danger of simply juxtaposing use and exchange, and as if there's a kind of, the danger is reifying use values. And in a way, that's a renaturalization. Because if you simply kind of say that use values, use values as generated by concretely heterogeneous labor is the kind of this pre-capitalist kind of condition, then that's another kind of naturalization, because you renaturalize use values and the qualities of concrete labor that generates kind of discrete use values, as if they could simply be kind of, read off any kind of, system of social production. And the philosopher who naturalizes use value is Aristotle. That's what you get, okay? If you renaturalize use value, if you think that there is concrete use, that use values exist in nature, it's Aristotle, and it seems to me that kind of Aristotelianism is also a kind of a, I think that Marx admires Aristotle, and but I think that he is absolutely not an Aristotelian. Okay, I haven't answered the. I'm sorry, I've gone off. I haven't answered your what you were asking me about humanism and about whether there's a kind of humanism implied in Sohnrettel's kind of account of the or critique of real abstraction. And whether it's incompatible.
Sorry, I was talking about Hegel and neo-rationalism and humanism. Okay, yeah, continue. I was just make sure. Yeah.
Yes, and just so, can you just restate the question you were asking me about?
Sure. My question was that for Sohnrettel, Hegel doesn't really arrive like as a, it's a kind of, there's a mystification to it because it overlooks the fact that we are, the binary thinking of Kant, for example, is characteristic of the commodity form, which is kind of the moment we're in. So he, but I guess what I was wondering here is if you look at, of course, for Sohnrettel, he goes into this kind of excavation and he's trying to, situate dualism, and I think the genesis of the subject position within modern philosophy, within sort of economic structures. But it's interesting here, like if you look at Derrida's piece, The Ends of Man, he does allude to a certain kind of humanism, which is already latent, in the Hegelian perspective, right? In terms of, well, okay, he draws an analogy with Husserl and the phenomenology, but then it's superseded in the logic, but there's still a kind of originary humanism, and he talks about Heidegger as well. Marx criticizes this as well. So again, is the question, if we look at Negrestani, he says, well, okay, inhumanism, well, that's not anti-humanism, as he's clear about. So the question is it possible that from a Marxist standpoint, the risk here is that one, by making that, that perspective sort of originary, right, that one reifies a certain kind of subjectivistic or humanistic thinking, even as they, purport to be, functioning within a structure that can give rise to like the rational as opposed to the real, or challenge existing notions of what the human is.
Okay, well, I mean, the category, yes, I mean, the category of subjectivity is, is indissociable from, from metaphysical humanism. It's the bedrock of metaphysical humanism, according to kind of, this, well, Heidegger. It's Heidegger. Derrida's, that point is Heideggerian, not particularly Derridean. Now the question then is whether, Marx is there a theory of the subject in Marx? No, there isn't, because the only subject that there is in capital is self-valorizing value. The capital itself is an automatic subject. And if one, I think, sees that labor itself is kind of, at least, as one foot in the capital relation, then I think, people assume that kind of Marx is committed to the claim that labor is a subject. And I don't think that labor is the kind of the revolutionary agent. And, these post kind of, the value critique people have, called that into question. I think if one distinguishes the proletariat from labor, if one sees labor or the working class as a kind of a subset of the proletariat, where to be a proletarian is simply to be reduced to one's labor power, to be a bearer of labor power, regardless of whether or not one is actually employed. And because capital kind of, increases unemployment. The question then is whether the proletariat is, the revolutionary subject. And what's interesting here is that, obviously, wage labor, capital reproduces itself through wage labor. So the wage laborer is, in a way, is contributing to kind of to capital's reproduction through their activity, which is also their, they have to kind of keep alive or reproduce themselves by selling their wage labor. But there isn't yet the sense in which kind of, labor is this kind of, support, or kind of basis for kind of capital reproduction doesn't, I think, mean that it can be understood as a subject. In other words, you have to be careful about an equivocation in the term subject, okay? Subject can mean both self-consciousness, like the Kantian subject. It can also mean agent, okay? Or like an active, practical generator. And I think that's, in a way, yeah, I think those two terms are not equivalent. And I think that Marx, in a way, the proletariat is not a subject in either sense, okay? It's not a subject in either of those senses. And that's why it doesn't actually, in a way, this is why I don't think Marx can be accused of humanism, or the kind of metaphysical humanism, which, Derrida and Althusser find, problematic. In terms of, Reza's work, I don't think what he calls the labor of the inhuman, which is this kind of, this work of constantly, of, revising our understanding of the, the capacities and potencies of the human is, I don't think that implies this kind of, again, this metaphysical subject as rejected, by Derrida and Heidegger and others. Because, the subject here is, again, the subject in this metaphysical, objectionable metaphysical sense is supposed to be the coincidence of self-consciousness and self-determination. Okay, so it's supposed to be this, it's both where, thinking and the pure coincidence of thinking and doing. And I don't see that presupposition operative in, in Reza's work. So yeah, I think it's, I mean, look, just to be very clear, I just don't think that this account, this Heideggerian account of the metaphysics of subjectivity and what's, supposedly why it's about this myth of self-presence or of pure identity, or of pure autonomy or of pure self-positing, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't think that those are adequate to the theory of the subject, developed by Hegel. And Marx complicates things further because he's, because of his critique of Hegel. But even the Hegelian subject isn't, guilty of all those, bad things that, Heidegger attributes to it. No, so basically, yeah, I'm the point of, I'm rejecting the claim that there is a philosophy of the subject, which assumes that consciousness is transparent to itself, that subjectivity is self-positing, that it's rooted in domination and the subjugation of, of every kind of variety of objects, etc., etc. I just, I don't believe that, actually. I just think that that is not true. So that's why I don't think that the category of subjectivity is, simply can be junked or kind of dispensed with.
Could I interrupt here for a second?
Yes.
So I think we could reframe this question by linking it to your original issue earlier in our session on the politics of ontology and the ontology of politics. If we look to one particular moment, for example, Maimond's critique of Kantian subjectivity, in particularly with reference to the manifold and the status of time as a category arising from the imagination or from the judgment. At one point, do we have to stop talking about the politics of ontology and talk instead about the politics of ontotheology? Because it seems to me that that particular moment represents a clash of ontotheologies, and that it's Maimond's subject position as a Jew, for example, trained in Kabbalism, which enables him to have the framing capacity to think outside the system that Kant is constructing, and to demonstrate that time and space as a relational grid is not a natural phenomenon, but a social phenomenon, or what we could say, not a universal phenomenon, but an epistemic phenomenon based on Kant's worldview. And that Maimond's critique of Kant represents a moment where one could see two ontotheologies basically clashing. So given that you have a very well worked out system for yourself, how do you look at that moment from the perspective of an ontology of politics versus a politics of ontology? I mean, how would you interpret that? And let me stop there. So let me see how you think through that foundational clash that occurs.
So you mean the Maimond's claim that space-time
is not natural but social, that it is
social
not, that it's not universal but epistemic.
I mean, in a sense, in a kind of trivial sense, I think I agree, because I think that, what we've discovered, what space and time really are is, becoming more and more mysterious in that, there's, I mean, as physics, advances, these things become, it's clear that these phenomena are, profoundly, all our intuitions about the structure of space, the nature of time are, superficial and unreliable. And therefore it's very plausible to say that, yeah, we, our understanding of space and time is conditioned by, an experience we have of it, which is, socially, which is, kind of socially conditioned. So, in a way, that's why I think that, I mean, I'm Kantian precisely because I think that it's, in a way, the more parsimonious you are with your ontological presuppositions. In other words, the more you can say, this is just our way, these are just conditions of experience or conditions of intelligibility, as opposed to constitutive features of things or of reality. In a way, the more you leave room for discovery and change and transformation. Whereas as soon as you claim to be able to kind of to deduce something about the nature of being qua being, which is, yes, the definition of metaphysics, yeah, the danger is always, anthropomorphism, the illicit projection of local and of local categories onto things in themselves. So in a way, look, I think that if Kant's critical revolution is the claim that human beings don't have a God's eye view. Okay, that's if the claim about epistemic finitude, and that we don't know things in themselves. We can think them, but we can't know them. However, we can know objects, empirically real objects. Is that we don't, have access to the intellectual intuition that would allow us to kind of that would make judgment unnecessary, because the distinction between subject and predicate would be irrelevant for a creature endowed with intellectual intuition. And I think Kant's framing of the problem is, is kind of uncircumventable. I think that any kind of in a way, this is, I mean, you use the term ontotheology. That's why I think it's, Kant shows the complicity between metaphysics, or dogmatic metaphysics and ontotheology. It assumes a kind of it not only assumes that there is, it doesn't just assume a supreme being, or a kind of a pivot or kind of anchor for the structure of being. It also assumes a kind of a homology between, the divine understanding and human understanding, but then simply say that there's a kind of, there's a limitation. Ours is finite, his is infinite. But then Kant shows that it's the other way around, that actually our concept of the divine understanding, which is the precondition for rationalist metaphysics, is an illicit projection or extrapolation from the features of the human understanding. And once you make that move, then already kind of, you can already, Feuerbach is already kind of visible in this move, the claim that, the divine, the transcendent perspective, the divine understanding of creation is simply kind of an estranged manifestation of our own kind of, capacity for understanding and experiencing. And that means that ontotheology is, domesticated, that, everything we say about God or about what the world would be like for a deity are simply kind of, extrapolations from our own understanding and experience.
But the fact that he does not decenter time and space in a relational grid, which must necessarily presuppose transcendence behind it, suggests that the task was not completed, which was...
I see. Okay, that's okay.
You see where I'm going here.
Yes. But then look, you could, okay. I mean, this is just off the top of my head.
In other words, Maimon is pointing back in some ways to Spinoza, in a very real sense, in part perhaps because Spinoza and Maimon share an ontotheology.
I mean, I take your point about how the decentering of time and space would be also kind of a consequence, but I mean,
but Kant is not willing to go there. He's not willing to go there. I mean, but he recognizes, while still alive, that Maimon basically confronts him on one of the fundamental underpinnings to his entire project.
Okay. There's two things I would say. Is that one is that a lot of post-Kantian philosophy was about kind of, overcoming, and obviously Hegel most famously, kind of the alleged dualism of concepts and intuitions. And, in a way, if you reintegrate sensibility into, reason and the understanding, then the claim is that time and space become conceptualized, become conceptually tractable. And that means, and if time and space are conceptually tractable, that means that, they don't need to have, we can think structures of time and space, which might be unintuitable. And a lot of kind of 19th century kind of, mathematics and physics kind of, proved that. But then this just shows that in a way, we can reinvestigate the structure, and we can think and conceive unintuitable kind of structures of time and space. And to do that, we don't need the resort to intellectual intuition. And the problem with, I love Spinoza, but the problem is, if you begin with the if God is the presupposition, this infinite substance with infinity of attributes, the problem is, how do we think from God's vantage point? And in a way, the dereliction of ontology is that, it's not possible to think from God's vantage point. And the claim is, we don't need to, why would we need to? It's only if you thought that, Kant's point was that you don't need God for universality and objectivity, okay? Kant shows how you can secure the conditions for, universal objective knowledge without having to, prove God. It doesn't need to depend on God. So then it becomes, so the question is, what role is God playing in this mode of philosophy? If God just becomes synonymous with something like the absolute, but then if you think about, the point is that the absolute itself is not simply a substance. After Hegel, the absolute is the becoming subject of substance. The absolute is not a transcendent object. And in a way, it's this, what I see as crucial in Kant is the demystification of transcendence. God is just transcendence. Kant is a great demystifier. He says, look, we can, the world's knowledge, our knowledge of reality can be secured without this anchoring in absolute transcendence. He domesticates God. He relegates God to this. Well, I think in one sense, God, Kant relegates God to the status of a regulative ideal. He says we need God to think, but he's useful. We can use God. We can use God to know without thinking that we can ever know God. And I think that's a kind of a beautiful domestication and demystification. And the question is, what people want. It's connected to this stuff about, the post-human. As I see, the problem is that people, it's another cipher for transcendence. And the question is, why do people, this disenchantment with the human, the claim that the human is a kind of a degraded, pernicious category, that it's not kind of, we don't want to kind of, to self-identify as human. It's a grubby, discredited category, etc. I think that it's important to understand the conditions under which this kind of disillusionment came about, also to understand the dangers of the alternatives, because, if the destitution of the human is the rehabilitation of transcendence, which it often is, it is in Heidegger, okay? Well, transcendence is another name for, or not just another name, but transcendence can be an alibi for domination. Okay? Absolutely. And that's Feuerbach's basic point. And people, this is why, the divinity or absolute transcendence, the unknowable, the ineffable can always be, is always a kind of a pretext for mystifications, which, become, sources of oppression. So, yeah, that's, thanks, but that's a very good question. Thanks.
Hi, I would like to ask a question if it's possible.
Yes.
I'm wondering about the theory of the subject. So I want to go back there. And I don't mean like a transhistoric subject, but human subjectivity, the self, the psyche. And I know in Neil Unbound, I think in the first chapter, you grapple with the work of Paul Churchland, and where he take Sellers and his Myth of the Given to critique folk psychology, and you say it's the critique is correct, but Paul Churchland's proposal, his very neurocognitive proposal of another theory of the subject, it's not necessarily the best theory out there. And I know this book came out in, I think, 2009, and since then you've engaged with Lacanian psychoanalysis. And I wonder what you think is like the state-of-the-art theory of the subject. Is it a set of functions? Is it some trans-historic entity? Or do you think that maybe artificial intelligence can give us an answer? So is AI something like, for the subject, like physics is to the world? Or how can we make sense of the subject? How does it work in a way?
Okay, I mean, it's also a difficult question. I mean, part of, since writing, that book was published in 2007, but actually written like in the, couple of years before. So yeah, I've changed, I've rethought a lot of things. And about the category of the subject, I think it was, reading, obviously from a neurocomputational perspective in a way, or actually think of like a thinker like Thomas Metzinger, okay, who gives you this extremely elegant and persuasive naturalization. This, the self-model theory of subjectivity says that subjectivity is a tractable natural phenomenon, which can be understood in kind of, neurocomputational terms. Now that's, but subject in that sense is precisely not what subject means in the post-Kantian tradition, where it's a subject of knowing, the cognizing subject that is at stake. So the question is whether the cognizing subject, the Kantian, the subject whose knowing, whose capacity to know requires this spontaneity, the spontaneity of pure apperception, whether this subject is reducible to this neurocomputational subject. And I think it's Sellers as the philosopher who shows that it's not. And the reason it's not is because, human, to be a person, to be, a partaker in the game of giving and asking for reasons, is to be endowed with, to be a concept monger, to be endowed with the capacity for kind of conceptualization and conceptual, a responsiveness to concept, and also a kind of a susceptibility to be motivated by concepts, which cannot be accounted for in neurocomputational forms because it involves a social dimension of rulishness, okay? It involves socially instituted norms. And that's that kind of, this normative dimension is precisely what can't be correlated or identified with any kind of set of neurocomputational patterns, no matter how complex. It can be correlated with what Sellers calls pattern-governed activity, but this pattern-governed activity can't simply, is not itself not simply kind of, neurocomputational tractable. So I think there's something about the sociality of, rational self-consciousness, that can't be adequately accounted for at these lower kind of, levels of explanation. Not that they should be ignored, but that, it can't be, you can't, you can't understand what it is that's going on using these kind of neurocomputational resources. And then the question is whether subjectivity in this kind of Selargian Kantian sense is whether it depends on whether it's tied to a kind of an understanding of the nature of rationality. Okay, this inferentialist account of meaning, and I also think that's only part of the story. So I think that's another kind of layer of analysis. But it seems to me that this, the sociality of reason thesis that is implied by this kind of Kantian Selargian, explanation already has to kind of, give some account of how our, meaning-making practices are, embedded in social structures, and more specifically, kind of social forms, and that's the third layer, which I think can only be that in a way that's the third layer where you can't objectivate social form in the way in which you can even kind of objectivate phenomena in the world or objects in the world. So in other words, there's something about the structure of rational subjectivity, which is kind of socially instantiated, but which can't be objectivated using the ordinary resources of kind of empirical science. Okay, it's not an object domain in the way in which kind of neurobiology or computational neuroscience might be an object domain. And that's why I think and that's the sense in which I think that there's something about the structure of subjectivity that eludes objectivation, not because of again, not because it doesn't transcend it, it doesn't transcend it vertically or metaphysically, but it transcends it horizontally because it involves this kind of these patterns of social forms upon which our kind of reason-giving practices, supervene. So I think the theory of the subject is very, is enormous, is perhaps the most difficult kind of philosophical problem. And I think that the phenomenon of subjectivity has these kind of different layers, okay? From the, I think there's no doubt that kind of that human subjectivity at one level, I think Metzinger beautifully explains kind of, why we experience the world from a situated, embodied point of view, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems that I don't think that says enough about how we are concept mongers, how we, we understand things conceptually and are motivated by concepts. And then I think you need different resources to explain that. And then the third layer would be the kind of the social historical layer. And that's where I think, Hegel and Marx are important because they want to say that that there's, I mean, what is it you're trying to explain when you're trying to explain subjectivity? And I think once you realize that it's not a kind of, it's a multidimensional phenomenon, then you realize that there's not just kind of, it's perhaps a mistake, it's a cognitive error to try to account for it, in one dimension, exclusively in one dimension.
I've got a question sort of following on from this. It's nice to talk to you again. So concerning social reproduction, so this is sort of the term which really jumped out at me in this essay. So most of my own Marxist theory that I've published has been concerned primarily with social reproduction, although I suppose I'm not a social reproduction theorist in the sense of Chithi Bhattacharya or scholars like that. But I think it's one of my concerns. And what my reading of your essay does is that there are these two appearances of the term or the process in this essay, and each sort of round off these two sections which you've written. I suppose one thing that this does is sort of links them together and shows us why these two sections belong in the same essay, which I was sort of wondering about. But the other thing that they do, I think, is they sort of pull you back from an otherwise foregone outcome. So in the first section, you make these very striking and I think very convincing critiques of post-humanism's critique, the focus on exclusion and so on. And I'm quite convinced by that. But the reason I'm convinced by it is that I'm a humanist. So I see these are the obvious ripostes to those positions. But what you do with social reproduction is you're talking about, what's this phrase? You say the mutability and the reshaping of the human by the interaction, the interplay of social reproduction and value reproduction, which you say will get into another point. So I suppose this is what I wanted to hear more about. But then in this in the second appearance, I found this even more interesting because in the second half, you've introduced negativity, Hegelian negativity, and you're defending it. So you're saying this makes more sense than the Heideggerian position, which again, I agree with. But at this point, sort of how you reel it back to Marx is you twin Marx with Freud. So this is why the human is not only mutable, but the source of mutability that is sui generis, but where Hegel ties this negativity to self-conscious, Marx and Freud extend it into the compulsions of social reproduction and libidinal repetition, both of which operate behind the back of self-consciousness. So social reproduction is there twinned with libidinal repetition and Marx is twinned with Freud, and these are the two critics of Hegel. But yeah, I find this very interesting because I feel like a lot of social reproduction theory has maybe been prone to a sort of parallel development where psychoanalytic insights and so on, these are sort of separate options. Either you're a psychoanalytic Marxist and you read Jacqueline Rose and whatever, or you're a social reproduction theorist and you read Shinjo Arusa. So this is what it seems to me is you're sort of reconnecting them in a way which I find very interesting. So firstly, value reproduction, social reproduction, and then twinning it with libidinal repetition. So yeah, I would be very interested to hear where you're going with this, because clearly from what you say in the essay, this is something you're still extending and developing. But I suppose also what I'd like to say is that to me, this shows like a lot of potential for sort of getting us out of a kind of potential rut between systemic thinkers and psychoanalytic ones.
Thank you. That's again a kind of a difficult question. And the truth, I mean, look, by social reproduction, I meant it, and I know I don't know enough about this because I haven't read, the vast kind of literature about social reproduction. I just simply meant it in a sense in which, Marx often uses it in the sense in which, human beings have to kind of, reproduce themselves, okay? They reproduce their own, kind of material conditions of existence. So that's, but obviously, then at the end, after the kind of the discussion of the revisitation of Hegel, after the kind of the discussion of kind of, Derrida, the term desire kind of becomes crucial, because in a way, the first moment when self-consciousness emerges in the phenomenology, in the transition from consciousness to self-consciousness, the first thing, self-consciousness is defined as this relational structure, which at the heart of which is desire, and self-consciousness desires itself. It desires itself in the form of another self-consciousness. So it relates to itself through another. So the category of desire is obviously important here, but then this is precisely the category that is, at the heart of psychoanalysis, that is fundamental for psychoanalysis. And actually, what is really, and in fact, what I still haven't figured out, and what I'm trying to kind of get to grips with is a relationship between desire and the drive, because that's the Lacanian distinction. Because there's, and in the first version of the essay, desire played little role. It was all about the drive, okay? Because I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for kind of Slovenian, Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupančič, their work on Hegel and Lacan. The way in which their account of the drive and why the drive is precisely kind of irreducible to instinct, and why it's a form of negativity, which can't be straightforwardly kind of, which doesn't seem to kind of slot into the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, so not to say that it's you can think it dialectically, but in a way it's a kind of it's a missing piece in the kind of the Hegelian jigsaw. So the points, and look, the reason, what strikes me is like you can go, once you've introduced self-consciousness, like the way in which recognition theorists go, and like I'm thinking of like Axel Honneth, they'll say, well, yes, to be human is humanity's desire for kind of recognition, okay, for social kind of social recognition, and then there's a politics that falls from that, which I think is problematic. But what's striking is that in Hegel, the moment in which self-consciousness arises is also the moment in which this kind of the conflict, the struggle to the death between the lord and bondsman arises. So it's not, you don't have this moment of kind of perfect mutual recognition. You have conflict. The first thing that happens is a struggle to the death, and that's so, which is to say that in a way that kind of the structure of desire isn't, desire emerges, but the structure of desire itself is not transparent to self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is, structured by and through desire, yet does not kind of, understand the nature of, what this desire is. And what I need, so it seems to me that what's crucial is to kind of to understand more about the structure of desire, but also how desire can't be reduced to this kind of ideal of, recognition, commutative kind of recognition. And I think that's what's interesting about, obviously Lacan in particular, is why he says, desire is always desire of the other, but it's always, it's never, it's incompatible with this account, this smoothing of conflict, and of confrontation, which seems to be, in other words, you can't simply, it's a critique of intersubjectivity. The point is that the kind of, the social recognition account says that, the space of self-consciousness, self-consciousness is this sphere of mutual recognition, of mutually recognizing subjects. And I think that, psychoanalysis says that absolutely not. No, it isn't. You can't understand it in that way. And so in a way, it's the dialectic of desire is necessarily, kind of, structured by these kind of, by antagonisms, which can't simply be, smoothed away or kind of overcome through something like kind of, communicational consensus or recognition. So in a way, and that's why I think that's, I mean, okay, this is, this is the stuff I'm still trying to work through, but I think one possibility is that Lukács's account of the standpoint of the proletariat, and in a way how the kind of the proletariat as self-conscious commodity is a reworking, is another kind of rewriting of this dialectic of lord and bondsman after Marx, so that the capitalist class relation in a way, is what blocks, is why mutual recognition cannot be instituted on the basis of self-consciousness. And in Lukács, there is a theory of the subject, of the becoming subject of substance, because ultimately the proletarian is simply a self-conscious commodity, is a thing, a mere thing. He's been reduced to kind of to labor power. He's been reduced to the status of a bearer of labor power, and socially nullified. But that very kind of reduction is the condition for subjectivation. A subjectivation which is predicated on the absence of recognition. It's your social eradication that is the condition for subjectivation. So I think, so what I want to do is to kind of revisit this kind of Lukácsian account, and then see if, but try to understand how, in a way, the proletarian desire is the desire to kind of to abolish, to destroy the bourgeoisie, abolish the class relation, is what kind of desire is this? And it's as if there's a missing episode in the phenomenology, which requires in a way taking resources from Lukács, but also from kind of from Lacanian psychoanalysis to work out. So yeah, but this is stuff that I'm still just trying to I haven't started writing this, but I'm in the dark about this, so I don't know how it's kind of going to play out. But yes, I think it's as soon as you start talking about self-consciousness as desire, then it's not the desire for recognition, but then what is it? That's the problem I'm trying to figure out.
Hi, Ray.
Hi.
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 Hi. I will just to I'll first very shortly pitch in on this later subject of recognition, where I agree with what you just said, that the desire and the phenomenology, it's not about recognition in the way Hornet would put it or Habermas would put it. It's about reading the whole chapter in understanding that the relationship between the lords and bondsmen, it's one that traverses all the figures in that chapter. For example, Stoicism and skepticism. It's if we take the interpretation that what distinguishes that certain aspect of a self-conscious desire, which is a desire of a desire to be desired, as also Lacan puts it, is in a certain sense is this self-affirmation of self-consciousness to be recognized as such, as a thing in the world, which would imply this kind of relation between lord and bondsman, that in skepticism, it's a question about who does the work. In skepticism, the world does the work so that I can be a skeptic. In Stoicism, I do all the work so that there is a world out there, so that there is normativity that impinges on me, and so on and so forth. So this, the reading of that chapter is more or less is what is to be real as a self-consciousness. It's not about intersubjectivity. It's about the battle to have reality, to have a right to desire and be desired in the end. But my question was the following: do you engage in this Marx and humanism debate with that part of the early Marx? I know early Marx is a bit controversial for purists, about alienation from a species being. I think I know that it's very not well seen for the opposers of the later Marx, that you still have this anthropological existential Marxism or humanist Marxism of the 44 of the pre-48 revolutions. But I think it offers a lot of possibilities in the end. This assertion that there is such a thing as alienation from a species being. First, it clears this relationship that between anthropology and ontology, as you put also in your text, between why Heidegger refusing humanism, as Derrida puts it, goes directly to ontology, of this accent on of the character of experience of always being mine, not of the human, but mine. But, and that is a way to circumvent anthropology and jump in ontology in a certain sense. That Marx would say that in capitalism, in alienation of labor, you cannot talk about human, or all talk about the human is cringe in the end. It's either you accentuate this alienation from the species being, this valuation of the own experience as what there is. So you cannot talk about the human, but about my experience, and all existentialisms and self-person literature and all this kind of stuff. It is an expression of this alienation from the species being. So all existentialism and so on. On the other side, all talks about a humanism understands human as a genre, as a genera, but not as a species. So it has a concept of the human by way of denaturalizing it, or taking it out from the natural order and put it making it as some sort of ontological animal, or something like that. So my question is, how would you engage with this alienation of the species being? Can this be a topic, this talk about humanism? Because you went on this critique of transcendence as post-humanism as a new modern way of putting the problem of transcendence. But if you take this kind of Marxist way of alienation of species being, you don't need that. You can all see them as symptoms of this impossibility and kind of formulating a notion of a species being.
Okay, thanks. That's very good. Actually, could you, and I might be wrong about this, I suspect, because it struck me, and maybe it's interesting when you pointed out the distinction between species being and the distinction you were insisting that it is species and not genus. Because this might just be a mistake on my part, but I thought, well, look, if Marx philosophically, it doesn't seem to make sense to translate Gattungswesen as species being, because then a species is subordinate to a genus, okay, and then you have to think the specific difference, and that's what metaphysics does. So like man is the rational animal, the talking animal. But I thought it was perhaps more promising to kind of to translate Gattungswesen as genus being, because a genus, interestingly for Aristotle, is not subsumed by anything higher, and generic differences are not kind of beholden to the logic of opposition or contrarieties. Genera are not opposed to one another. They are unlike one another. In other words, what's interesting, or at least on my kind of take on the genera species distinction, is that you can only measure likeness and unlikeness within a genus in terms of species and individual, but genera are radically unlike anything. They, hence sui generis. And I took Marx to be suggesting that this is the kind of that precisely, to talk about human genus being is to say, simply to say that it's unlike, it's different, it's unlike anything, but this difference cannot be specified. It cannot be specified because humans are making themselves. Human beings are in the process, because humanity is a process, and human beings are making themselves through kind of the social reproduction. Now, of course, then the danger is to attribute this capacity for kind of self-transformation to a transcend, like to say that this is kind of but I took what would be philosophically interesting, and the way in which I read kind of Marx's critique of Feuerbach is when he says, when he talks about the kind of the primacy of subjectivity as praxis, as kind of social, a sensuous kind of productive activity. is that he means that this productive and reproductive activity is precisely, in a sense, unconscious. It's not like we don't know what we're doing when we kind of reproduce ourselves. So in other words, we don't know what we are. That's what the point is. That so we're not reproducing ourselves according to kind of, we don't know what we are. And, at least on the traditional humanist understanding of Marx would be that, history begins once we kind of, we start gaining kind of control of, the process of social, the ways in which we reproduce ourselves, and, we determine our own, ends. But I can see that that's, maybe that's a classical kind of, interpretation, which I think would be still, does that reinstate the transcendence that you think is unnecessary, actually, that you don't need if you read? Can you say more about how you take the species genus, why it's important to kind of to insist on human species as opposed to kind of genus, and why this is what avoids transcendence?
Yes, sure. So if you take that Marx criticizes the generality of Feuerbach, of having this that by his thesis on it, that this form of atheism of Feuerbach, you can see later in Kojève as well. If you dethrone the transcendence of God and put this self-actualized, self-creating human individual in its place,
yes.
In that moment, as also in the text you sent of Derrida's text you sent, that they'd also criticized that it didn't transcend onto theology. You just reverse the boss, just put it. And in this sense, Marx would say that not only that you do not know what you do, that you do not know what enables you to think in this way, but also you do not understand the fact that you will always have this distinction between this generality that you call man, that is not, that cannot ever apply to, the plight of the proletarian or the l'âge des bourgeois and all these things on grounds of this very generality, which then it makes for us that indeed the human being is transforming, and it has this ability to being practical. But it also, by this very being practical, the human being does not allow this kind of relationship to itself, to its own concept. And in this sense, you can then understand it as, I think Adorno or whatever value form theorists would put in this way, that this implies a certain kind of transhistorical concept of labor. And I would say it's not about humans' negotiations with nature, which is the way you understand this practice, but the very social character of that practice. So you should not ask the question in relation to nature, what the human species is, or what the human universal is, but the way it is defined and thus alienated in its own social world. This thesis that labor and capital is social by nature and it's not well understood by its relation to nature. And in that sense, the notion of the human is something that it should be looked on only in the social sphere, not in its in its difference to horses or cats or dogs and so on and so forth.
Okay.
And then the problem, the alienation, you can then put the question of the alienation as the problem between the I and the we, or the I and the generality or the universality. And as that, what is then the problem with capitalism? If the problem with capitalism is only to be seen in the social world, it is a problem of mediation between what we call in the social world the human and me being me
Mm.
in this sense. Mm.
Thanks. Okay, that's very helpful. And I mean, yes, so I completely agree with in a way, the kind of the whole point is that the, metaphysical kind of disquisitions about, the nature of the human, or like, in relation to kind of other, the non-human as such, is, should be avoided, is unnecessary, and that actually, gets you into all sorts of kind of problems. And I agree that that's why I think that Marx kind of thinks that it's kind of completely, it's otiose, so that there's a kind of, the point is to kind of, is a critique of, of the way in which the kind of, the ideological function of the category of the human. In a way, I completely agree with that. So why, I guess the question is, it's because, in a way, it's a kind of, because of the rejection of the category, in a way. I mean, that's the good way, in a way, of neutralizing the kind of, the metaphysical import of the category, okay? But it seems to me that, in so-called post-humanism, there's a claim that the category, it's not just that the category serves a pernicious social role, it's that the category is just bad, in that it's repressive, or kind of, or exclusionary, tout court. So it's like, it's not, it's not a kind of, it's a metaphysical critique of a metaphysical category, as opposed to a kind of a social critique of a metaphysical category. And in a way, that's why, that's what, I mean, that's what motivates, in a way, the whole paper, like, so the other thing is, and to be honest, I'm not sure I've got, a good answer to this, is that freedom, what is, Marx, the critique of exploitation is tied to a critique of domination, okay? And it seems that, critical theorists, agree that domination, capitalism, is a kind of is a system of social domination, by real abstractions. So it's abstract domination. And the question is, like, what does domination mean? And it seems that if you want to have a non-naive understanding of domination, but non-naive, but a post-Hegelian understanding of domination, you can't just say, oh, particularity is dominated by generality, concrete singularity is dominated by, abstract universal. I think those are really unhelpful and actually just vacuous kind of accounts of cashing out of domination. So, and I think, so actually, I think that the critique of domination does involve, I mean, well, I think that's why freedom is important, because what is, what is being dominated, domination is the kind of, the suppression, or the, the cancellation of something like, I don't know if the capacity for freedom, that's a kind of a naive formulation, but it seems to me that, or yeah, again, it's because of this, what would what do we need to be liberated from, and what would liberation be? And I think that if it's the concept of freedom that turns out to be kind of, and it might not be, but like I kind of, if one assumes that the concept of freedom is, you know, crucial to kind of, to Hegelian kind of, to post-Hegelian philosophical anthropology, then Marx is a humanist to the extent to which he thinks that human beings ought to be free. Okay, and freedom isn't just defined in terms of, you know, and that the, you know, the negative and positive freedoms available under capitalist social relations are inadequate, fail to do justice to the freedom that is proper to the human. Now, obviously, this is, and in a way, this is where humanism comes back. You know, if one makes those claims, then one is kind of a humanist, and this is why I think it's a link between, you know, the human and the concept of freedom, in a way that, at least it seems to me, makes these questions, or at least kind of pressures, you know, one into kind of, into saying something about the human, and not into simply saying, because I know that there, you know, there are Marxists who say, who are, you know, who take themselves to be kind of you think, you know, the human is a bourgeois ideological category, we don't need it, etc., etc. But then, yeah, what does, I mean, you know, you could say, what does oppression mean? Like, you know, there's a sinister, I remember seeing a kind of a friend's, you know, sinister portrait of, you know, a jackboot on a baby's head, you know, and, you know, with the caption, what does oppressing you mean? Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about oppression, domination? Exploitation is a different, exploitation is not kind of domination or oppression. It's a different analytical category for Marx, but it's to make sense of in a way of domination. I think that we need to say something about freedom, and it's hard to talk about freedom without saying something, or at least it's hard for me, I don't know, but to say something about the human. Now this, I don't know, but I'm not confident about this. This is just like, these are kind of, you know, hunches. And but what do you think about this?
No, it's, yeah. So to take this point about freedom. So I get a very good point of Marx regarding like a post-humanist discussion will be, if you don't like the notion of the human, you need to look at the social world and not make plants think. So that would be the general point. Regarding freedom, it would be that I am also a bit uneasy of the relationship between freedom and a notion of the human. Because if you look at authors like Schelling, who I think is one of the first one who gives freedom to things, is to say that, as Schelling frames the discussion, on the one side you have systematic thinking, you have systematic philosophy. On the other side, we have this evidence of freedom that every human being, according to Schelling, has this manifest evidence of feeling free or being free. Now the problem is okay, every one of us has maybe this idea that we are walking around and we take decisions and we feel free. The problem begins the moment when you try to put that in concepts, to bring that in systematic philosophy, which is what Schelling tries to do. Now, the moment when you ascribe to that immediate evidence of freedom, you put directly on it categories like humanity, and you make it in some sort of universal, transcendental. You give it transcendentality. You give it universal. It becomes difficult because it is the moment when you take it out of or of any kind of possibility to historize it. So I think it's this similar problem that you have with this myth of the given, with givenness as such. You can be, as Heidegger would put it, and take that feeling or immediate experience of freedom and try to circumvent any kind of anthropology and jump directly in the sort of fundamental ontology, he puts it. And by that, in my opinion, he circumvents the whole problem of history, or you try to make it the notion of the human itself, and then you have something that the problem of freedom pertains to our definition of the human, like the post-humanists do, and not as a history of struggles or history of humanity, where that notion of freedom, you see that experience being translated in a different frameworks with different notions with it, and so on and so forth. So I think it's Schelling puts it very, very correctly. We have this experience, and I need to systemize it. But the way you ascribe concepts to it, the way you integrate it in a system of philosophy, is something that is what is historical in the end in philosophy. How you translate that, how you put concept it. There's no necessity to put it in this way or in another way. It doesn't have ontological grounds, or it does not depend on a definition of the human or stuff like this, I guess.
Okay. No, I see. That's very helpful again. But then what would you think about those, I guess, Hegelian Marxists who would say, no, we can, freedom emerges as a kind of, as a key kind of category, of modernity. Like in modernity, we kind of, the concept of freedom only kind of, emerges, and initially it's kind of, it's brandished by, bourgeois revolutionaries, but this is still a kind of, a negative, it's freedom tied to property rights, etc. But the claim would be that there is a concept of freedom which is, fundamental to kind of understanding kind of, social modernity. It exists in truncated form, in bourgeois capitalism. The task is to realize it, and this is the kind of the revolutionary task. So the claim is that it's not this kind of ontological, it's not this pure ontological kind of Abgrund or whatever. It is historically specific, but it is the kind of the category of modernity, and the realization of modernity requires a kind of the actualization of freedom.
I disagree a bit. So it's two arguments. The first one is that the discussion of freedom is not specifically modern. You have all these scholastic philosophers discussing free will. And if you then look at the birth of social contract theory of Thomas Hobbes, he had in Leviathan, his question is, how can I argue for absolute monarchy without recurring to God? And he writes a theory of the human will. So in a certain sense, I think modern political philosophy it is about freedom, but not that kind of the freedom that by immediate express me walking around and believing myself to be free. It becomes a political concept, and it becomes something which legitimizes power. This is the difference between, let's say, the absolute monarchy or Middle Ages monarchy that is based on divine right of kings. It becomes so freedom there is not normative. It's not the source of political power, of legitimating power. So freedom becomes social legitimacy in modernity. So it's about authority, not about freedom. If you look at Hegel's philosophy of right, you do have a notion of freedom that is distinguished from Willkür, from contingent will, in its way of legitimizing authority. So you have abstract rights that are based on exactly this experience of me being free. So my experience of being a free individual entitles me to certain rights, and it has stages of a different analytic of freedom that has a number of understandings of it. So in the end, modernity is about how you legitimate power. You legitimate power. It's not of a evidence of freedom that is. I don't think it's bourgeois or proletarian or anything, or human.
Okay. Okay. No, that's very good. That's very helpful. That's actually, yeah. I'm going to have to, think about this. Thanks, Sandra. I think there's a bunch of questions I should probably try to address in the chat. Okay, I'll just read them in order. The first question was, is there any way of having an explanation? It's from Blicero, and it's, is there any way of having an explanation of being's constitution without using some kind of metaphysical given? E.g., the most basic relations like difference or similarity seem necessarily preconceptual and necessary for the concept themselves to be. I'm not sure I agree that basic relations of difference and similarity would be preconceptual. I mean, I think, already I think that, to kind of, the relation of identity and difference seems to be kind of, conceptual, or at least I don't, I don't see how one could, distinguish between identity and difference, without resorting to concepts. So perhaps I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question. Would you like to, could you clarify, or?
Yeah, I can try to clarify. What I mean is that for concepts to, for us to hold concepts or understand concepts, before concepts, things must be either identical or not identical. Right? The difference or identity must be there for concept to be applied. Simply without understanding A different from B, there is no concept of relations, the structures of the world between A and B. First, I should, quote unquote, understand the difference between A and B. And this understanding of the difference seems like a bit of a given, a cognitive, neurobiologic given. And that makes it difficult for any systematic understanding of how logical, epistemological subject comes to be get rid of the myth of the given, as long as it is based on the question of, is it first experience that becomes knowledge, or is it the mind that makes the experience what it is? As long as this question is the question, it seems to be we are always in this contradiction. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Okay. I guess, yeah, I'm not I mean, if I think of, it seems to me that you're saying that, the kind of the law of identity, A equals A, is the, is itself, is not just a logical law, it's this kind of necessary, metaphysical, this necessary metaphysical premise. Is that what you're saying? Everything is necessarily self-identical?
For the law of identity or principle of non-contradiction to be applied both to objects and to thought, right? The law of thought to be similar to the law of nature. Where this you said that we cannot say that there is a correspondence between these kind of normative practices and what are material inference. There's not a, if I understand you correctly, there's not a straight bridge between them. But what is interesting is that then how laws of thought, which are basically the constraint and abilities that makes us what we are, makes any sapiens what it is, are in us or works in us, actually, maybe that's the most fundamental question of philosophy. Maybe it's a bit, maybe it's like asking nothing. I don't know.
Okay, I mean, this is a very difficult question, but I'll say one thing. I mean, Aristotle famously insists, in a way, it seems to me that Aristotle makes a similar claim by saying that the kind of the law of these three logical laws: identity, excluded middle, and non-contradiction, are kind of in a way necessary to think about, to do metaphysics, to think about what is. Our thinking must be constrained by these laws. However, it seems to me that Aristotle's kind of account, Aristotle's articulation of logic and ontology, of the laws of saying and the laws of being, is already kind of premised on a claim that to be is to be one, to be is to be a substance. And it's because to be is to be a substance, and substance is necessarily self-identical, although it can admit of contrary predicates. It's that, in a way, it's the unity of substance, okay, that guarantees the kind of the exclusion, the non-coincidence of contraries, and therefore the law of non-contradiction. So here I think, and the problem is that this would be a form of the myth of the given, not an empiricist form of the myth of the given, but a logist, a rationalist, because you're saying that to be is to be one, but oneness is a concept.
That's basically Spinoza, right? Sorry to cut you off, but that's basically Spinoza, not?
No, because Spinoza says everything is one, and
yes.
Aristotle says no, like being, what is consists of distinct, discrete, discontinuous, separate substances. Everything is not.
Okay.
Everything that is one, but everything is not one. If you see what I mean, because being is discrete. Yes. There are many substances, not one. But that claim itself about the oneness of substance, but the claim also that there are many substances, against kind of Parmenides and others, that is itself not, that's the condition then for insisting that therefore our discourse is governed by the law of identity and non-contradiction, etc. I mean, that would be a metaphysical premise, which is not, which Aristotle just says, you can't, he says you can't think if you don't take these laws for granted. But it seems to me that his thinking of the oneness of being, or more accurately, that substance is the primary or the focal sense of being, although there are different ways of being, that is precisely not something that can be kind of, well, that is a form of the given, but it's a metaphysical given in a way which is debatable, because what is the whole problem in metaphysics is what makes one thing the thing it is. Like what is the principle of individuation? What is oneness? How do you count one? And that's
can we eliminate this? Can we eliminate this understanding of individuation, or is it impossible?
Well, we can't. The problem is that it's difficult. Well, I was going to say, it's difficult to think without it, but at the same time, it's difficult. It's objectionable to turn it into a principle. There are a type. Okay, Badiou is a contemporary philosopher who tries to think, being without oneness. Okay, and he resorts to kind of, to mathematics to do so. So yes, you can do without it. But you still need, being is not one, but you still need, what he calls a count of one, a principle. You need to understand, unification as a result, if not as a kind of initial premise. Okay. But then that means that there isn't, well.
Can you understand as a practice? not as a result, not as an axiom, not as an starting axiom, but as a practice, as in you make unification of concepts to be able to do something. What is that something else? What that something is up to debate, random and stuff. But do you understand what I'm saying? Or
I'm not sure.
Not sure. Okay.
Maybe
I'm not able to articulate it anyway. I will think about it. Thank you for your answer. It was very beautiful.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps thanks for the question. I think I should move on. There's a lot. So the next question is from Kirill Potapov. Kirill writes, in the proudly humanist Hegelian Marxist tradition of Vygotsky and Ilyenkov, there is a critique of the gerrymandering of the demarcation of the human, which Ray agrees with, but seems to be reinscribed in Ray's privileging of what we can't know as between the unconscious and conscious and the manifest and scientific. Would you deny that they are interdependent, but why treat a view from nowhere as higher? I don't mean nowhere, but independent of the ideal in which we are at home. Okay, well, first thing, again, I'm not sure. I don't think the view from nowhere, in a way, the opposition between nowhere and somewhere is perhaps unhelpful for kind of trying to understand, for these debates about the kind of, the particular and the universal, etc. And again, could you, I'm not sure I'm kind of grasping the question. Could you maybe kind of just, jump in to kind of elaborate the, the fundamental points you're getting at?
Yeah, sure.
Hi.
Thanks, Ray. Hi. Yeah, I only mean that in quite a few of your essays, you really focus on what we sort of fail to grasp within our practice, and you sort of talk about the ways in which we sort of are kind of not appreciating the conditions for our practice, and I guess that sort of follows your recent engagement with Lacan, etc. What the cultural historical tradition that I'm speaking of kind of suggests is that the way in which we're kind of experiencing our everyday ideal experience is already kind of scientific. So we wouldn't necessarily cut off what is manifest from us and kind of progressively so from what we're sort of failing to get given kind of some if there were a God's eye view watching our practices that.
Okay, thanks. Okay, now again, it's a very interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way, and I need to, to read more Ilyenkov and Vygotsky. The claim, I think this is very. I mean, I now think maybe it's kind of the opposition of or the dualism of manifest and scientific is perhaps. I mean, Sellers says more about the kind of the different explanatory strategies, that each image involves. He says one is postulational. The scientific image is postulational, whereas the manifest is correlational. But I think in a way that, I don't want to say that we never know what we're doing, that there's kind of, that it's, it's impossible for us to kind of, to ever grasp what it is we're really engaged in doing. And I think, in a way, the Marxian point that there are, for instance, commodity exchange, the practices that we engage in on a daily basis are precisely ones that we can't, immediately understand unless we kind of, we take this detour through kind of the resources of, reflexive conceptualization. But then, so yes, so I wouldn't want to say that like, there's something, it's too, yeah, the term unconscious is too strong. It's not like, actually, I think this is part of this is that Sonrettel insists that in the exchange abstraction, when you're engaged in exchanging commodities, the unconsciousness is that you can't, it's a condition of the exchange relation that you not be conscious of what it is you are doing. So for instance, the fact that you assume you necessarily, the condition of exchangeability is that the thing will be absolutely unchanged. Its qualities remain kind of identical and invariant in the exchange. And says this is a presupposition, but it's something that you can't consciously think when you're engaged in exchanging. And he mentions a couple of others, and it's those kind of determinations are precisely the ones that fuel kind of conceptual abstraction or logical abstraction. But I think that this is too strong, and in a way, this idea. So for Sonrettel's account, there is a sense in which you can't think what you're doing. In a way, the kind of the condition for you doing what you're doing is that you don't think, or that you not be conscious of it, and that is something that Zizek, in his first book, Zizek, in the Sublime Object of Ideology, there's a really interesting discussion of Sonrettel, and this is where he says that this is, he aligns this with kind of with repression, saying that this is a kind of a structural blockage. You cannot be conscious, but I think, in a way, that was influencing my thinking, and I mean, that's a very powerful idea. But now, the more I kind of rethink, kind of the plausibility of Sonrettel's account, maybe that is again implausible. So maybe, yeah. So maybe it's too strong to kind of just simply kind of to disconnect, kind of practice and comprehension. But what is important is to insist against, I think, for instance, against the resort to pre-ontological understanding in Heidegger, or simply to kind of to implicitness, is that it can't be, I don't think that what is implicit in your practice can automatically be deciphered or comprehended using your extant conceptual resources. So in other words, it may be that there's a kind of a theoretical dislocation is required to be able to grasp what it is you were actually doing. So I guess, because otherwise you get the kind of the Wittgensteinian quietist account, that it's exactly that, there's a way ordinary practices have a kind of, have a kind of rationality to them, but this rationality, in a way, is only kind of legitimate so long as it's not, as you don't try to theoretically articulate it. Because as soon as because theory cannot but distort and misrepresent, the logic of these practices. And that's the view that I kind of, want to resist, on the other hand. So in a way, it's like avoiding both extremes on the one hand, okay. Thanks very much. Thanks. I think there's a bunch of questions, so I think I need to kind of to move on. There's a question from David W. Could I discuss my position on engagement as it relates to subjectivity in my current work? I am thinking in particular of Badiou's conception of subjectivity as arising from within the invented site, as from an engaged position. Yes, well, I mean, again, without kind of repeating, you know, what I said about, you know, subjectivity before, but yes, I think in a way, subjectivity cannot but be engaged. So I don't think that kind of, in a way, it's the assumption that there could be a disengaged or disinterested or purely contemplative subjectivity, which is, you know, pretty implausible, you know, to begin with. But if you think of subjectivity as kind of, you know, as necessarily practical, even in its kind of, you know, in its rationality, as always doing something, and if thinking itself is a kind of doing, then, you know, rationality is always engaged, and it's engaged in doing something. But then, obviously you mean political engagement, you mean a stronger sense of engagement, and here, but in a way, I think this follows. I mean, there's this phrase from Sellers, which I really, you know, love. Thinking is a doing because inferring is an act. So if inference is like, you know, the substructure, if material inference is the kind of the substructure of rationality, then, you know, you're always, you know, thinking is necessarily doing. And, you know, to say that something is true is to indicate that something is to be done. So if you think that something is true, you also think that something needs to be done. And in that sense, political engagement follows ineluctably from, you know, understanding. The more you try to, if rationality compels you to try to understand social reality, you know, there's, you know, it's like, you know, you philosophize, it's implausible to kind of, to screen certain kind of areas of reality off from kind of philosophical reflection and analysis. So if social reality, if reflection upon social reality leads you to believe, you know, that there are, you know, for instance, that Marx's analysis is true, then there's something to be done. I think the difference would be that where Badiou thinks that truth is the result or the consequence of militant engagement, you know, you decide that, you know, an event, something happened, and on the basis of that decision, you commit yourself to kind of, you know, an investigation of the consequences of this kind of thing. And this kind of, this commitment, this practice, this is what generates truth. Truth comes at the end of commitment. And I mean, I think that's the, I think, yeah, I'm not sure that it's necessary. Again, there's a concept of truth, which is more prosaic, but also means that you can connect thinking and doing. It means that you don't need the disconnection between truth and knowledge, which is, you know, again, which is fundamental for Badiou, because nothing you know will tell you what has to be done. And this is, you know, but again, once again, I think this is a consequence. Badiou's prognosis here is conditioned by a specific historical conjuncture, which is to say the perceived kind of inability of a certain type of kind of Marxian analysis to prescribe, you know, militant intervention. So then, so the idea is that political economy won't help you kind of, you know, decide, you know, what needs to be done. And again, I think that this is, you know, I understand why that kind of diagnosis might have been compelling, you know, in 1970 and afterwards, but I think it's, I think it's implausible. I think it's not that the very kind of specific and doctrinaire kind of application of the critique of political economy and the nefarious politics that followed from it, i.e. the French Communist Party. Okay. And the second part of the question is, engagement also played a crucial role in the conclusion of Nihil Unbound, our conversation with extension. Yeah, this is, again, in a way, there was a theory of the subject, you know, the account of binding extinction implies an account of subjectivation, which I simply didn't have the resources to deliver. And part of, you know, what I'm trying to do is to figure out, you know, is to kind of to think about, you know, subjectivation. But that's why, you know, my inability to do so in that book was tied to the resources, you know, the limited resources I was using. This is why I think Hegel and Marx are kind of crucial, you know, for generating a theory of the subject. But the question of engagement is, yes, because I think it's, the point about binding extinction is that extinction is, I mean, just to be very simple, it's precisely, it's supposed to be something that is, you know, grabs you by the throat and not something, it doesn't allow you the luxury of, you know, contemplative resignation. And in a way, it's the idea of like resisting the lure of resignation, because that's what I'm trying to kind of, that's why I'm interested in kind of connecting thinking and doing, and not, you know, not simply kind of opposing them to one another. Okay, I'll move on. Okay, there's a note. Andrew Chitty, yep, I'll check that out. Okay, there's a quote from Ige Choban. Marxism is either a theory of liberation or it is nothing. It lays the basis for achieving a new human dimension without which no society is truly viable. As a Marxist humanist, this appears to me the whole truth of Marxist human. That's from Raya Dunyavskaya. Excuse my pronunciation. Thanks. That's in relationship to the discussion with Andre about, you know, Marx and freedom. Which I think, yeah, but I think Andre's, yeah, this is a very complicated issue, which I need to kind of to go back to. Okay, there's another question from, or remark from Kirill. Do you want me to read this out, Kirill? This, okay, sorry. Okay.
No, that's fine. I was just indulging myself. Thank you.
Okay, okay, Kyle, a question from Kyle. Do you differentiate your ideas regarding social reproduction and naturalization of capitalist ideologies, you value, etc., from Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony? If so, where and how do you differ? Is recognition, as you're calling it, related to love, and is love distinct from desire? It seems this conversation could benefit from an acknowledgement about how the subject, object, commodity of the enslaved body undermines the antagonistic and oppositional framework of much of our thinking, and the ways in which critical analysis of power is denaturalized from the humanist, post-humanist debate in favor of a kind of rebranding or continued naturalization of long-standing essentialist, identitarian, religious, and nationalistic ideologies inherent to the self, other transcendental belief structure. Is desire for freedom, singularity, power, individuality, otherness, a naturalized desire? Okay, with regard to the first part of the question about Gramsci and cultural hegemony, well, yes, it seems that kind of, there is a capitalist ideology that depends on naturalizing social relations, and I think, I mean, I've really, I'm sorry to say I know very little about Gramsci, but yes, it seems to me that there's a one sense in which bourgeois intellectuals naturalize certain social relations through by or create categories that can be used to naturalize capitalist social relations. And this becomes hegemonic when it simply shapes a way of thinking and feeling, when people internalize these assumptions and start to kind of, understand reality through this optic. So, but I think that's a very loose sense of hegemony. I'm not sure it's a precise kind of sense of cultural hegemony. So, I mean, yeah, I would just say, yeah, there's liberalism is a hegemonic discourse because there's assumptions about individuality, about freedom, about recognition, et cetera, which are hegemonic in, intellectual, academic discourse and, culture more generally. So I'm not sure where I differ from Gramsci because I don't know him well enough. So the next is recognition related to love. Again, I'm not sure I'm sure it's related, but I'd be hard put to kind of explain, where it's, its degree of difference, okay? It's not the same. And recognition for, I think, recognition precisely is not, it's a mistake to simply kind of reduce, self-consciousness's desire to the desire for recognition. So in a way, that's why, I think recognition is not kind of fundamental to desire. Is love distinct from desire? Yes, but again, I can't, say much more because my knowledge of psychoanalysis is kind of too schematic to make, to kind of to explain how exactly it differs. And then acknowledging the how the subject-object commodity of the enslaved body undermines the antagonistic and oppositional framework. I mean, I would have thought an enslaved body, surely enslavement would seem to me to kind of, to require an antagonistic and oppositional perspective. Even using the word, unless one does not even recognize one's enslavement, and kind of has been, convinced to accept it in some way, surely just recognizing that one is enslaved would entail that one kind of has an antagonistic and oppositional relationship to, whoever is doing the enslaving. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
If I could clarify,
yes.
Perhaps it was a word use problem with antagonistic, but I meant more in relation to a dialectic or an oppositional framework in terms of an object / subject or commodity. One body embodying all three of these seemingly discrete categories of subject, object, and commodity.
Okay, I see. Thanks. Okay. Yes. Okay. In a sense, but then, so you mean in a way like the, someone who is enslaved is at once a kind of, subject, object, and,
they
commodity.
become Marx's commodity who speaks, right? The kind of
Yes, although the distinction between, wage labor and slave is also important. I mean, there's a very good paper by John Clegg about this. It's been published about the role of slave labor in a capitalist economy, because I think, there's debates about, if capitalism only uses kind of wage labor, how do you account for the persistence of slavery in advanced capitalist kind of societies like America? And this paper is, John Clegg explains very clearly that the conceptual distinction between the slave and the wage laborer is fundamental. In a way, because the difference being that whereas the wage laborer hires their labor power to the employer, okay, the slave just is bought and sold, is itself a commodity. So it's the difference between wage labor, the worker, the wage laborer owns a commodity, his labor power, her labor power that she sells to the capitalist, okay, or more exactly that she rents to the capitalist for the duration of the working day, whereas the slave is a commodity that is owned by the capitalist. There's also, I mean, just going back, so conceptually, I think the distinction is fundamental, which is not to say, I don't think Marx, and John Clegg explains very well, it's not the case, Marx doesn't say, and nowhere does his account imply, that capitalism is incompatible with slave labor. On the contrary, capitalism will happily kind of use slave labor as part of the circuit of, commodity production. So in a way, labor power is a commodity producing commodity, but so is slave labor, okay? But they play different, different roles. There's a very, very interesting discussion of the difference between proletarian wage labor and slave in Lukasz's reification and consciousness of the proletariat. And it's very interesting about the subject-object distinction, because Lukács says, look, the slave is an object, is kind of a talking tool. And when the slave is being used, by the master in the labor process, they are effectively reduced to the kind of, the status of an object. They are kind of socially annihilated, okay? They don't exist as persons. So they are they are socially reduced to the object level. However, the slave, as we know, a slave can also kind of assume, a freed slave can assume the social status of a subject. Where subject and object here are social statuses, not kind of metaphysical distinctions. And Lukács points out that, of course, a slave can, understand that they have been reduced to the level of an object, and, they can understand their own objectivation from a subjective vantage point. But here the subject and object poles are separated by a distance, okay? So in a way, the slave is treated as an object, but they can relate to themselves, they can adopt the subject stance towards themselves, and see themselves, understand their own reduction to the status of an object, okay? He says with the wage labor, the proletarian, it's different. There's a coincidence of subject and object, precisely because it's just, you are a bearer of labor power, okay? So in a way you have to kind of, and there's a self-objectification. It's in the slave relation, the slave is objectified by the master, whereas the proletarian has to objectify themselves in selling their labor power. And that's crucial, because it's this kind of self-objectification in the kind of reduction in when, you know, you simply kind of sell your labor power to the employer, that, you know, allows for the reversal, the kind of the becoming subject of substance. The object can then be turned back into a subject, but only through, you know, only by destroying the social relations, which, you know, necessitate their constant, you know, kind of self-objectification. So that's a very, yeah, I mean, I think, yes, Lukáš is a person who has very interesting things to say about this. And then, okay, then the question of the way in which critical analysis is denaturalized from the humanist, post-humanist debate in favor of a kind of rebranding or continued naturalization of long-standing essentialist identity and religious and nationalistic ideologies inherent to the self, other transcendental belief structure. Is desire for freedom, singularity, power, individuality, others, and naturalism. Can you help me a bit with that, the last part of the question?
Yeah, and full disclosure, it's probably the least crystallized in my thinking, but I can't help but be suspicious of the kind of the debate of the post-human being more about a rhetorical turn than a conceptual one in some cases, about sort of shifting language while still kind of maintaining an Enlightenment idea. I guess, I mean, no non-humans or post-humans were invited to today's conversation, for instance. You know, we haven't asked Zoom what it thinks about this whole thing. You know, and,
yes, I mean, yes, I would kind of agree, and that's, you know, there's good. I mean, I think the key question is, what motivates this, you know, desire for the non-human or post-human? I mean, it's very, I think that's, you know, what is the investment in the post-human? Why do people, you know, this, you know, what is it about, you know, that why is, you know, the category of the human so kind of, you know, seen to be kind of not of interest? It's not just that it's not of interest, it's kind of, you know, problematic and objectionable. And I think that's the question I'm interested in. And also it's striking that, you know, you know, it's very interesting amongst, you know, with some post-humanists, you know, they're very kind of selective about what forms of the non-human. There's a kind of a hierarchy of the non-human. And for instance, you know, people, you know, post-humanists, when they talk about, it seems that, you know, you can be more or less kind of non-human. So, you know, kind of gerbils and rabbits are not supposed to be kind of glamorous examples of, you know, the inhuman. But things like squids and reptiles and bacteria are. But if you think about it, like, how is that kind of, you know, how is this continuity of kind of, you know, how can something be more or less kind of, you know, non-human? And of course, it's completely kind of, you know, anthropocentric. It's because, you know, like reptiles and squids and so on are like, you know, they're because we're mammals, so they are more unfamiliar. So it's this, there's a kind of exoticism at work here. Okay, there's like, you know, a desire for like an even more exotic other, which is, you know, very visible in a lot of fetishizing of, you know, the non-human.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I think this popularization and this influence of this discourse, the certain discourse of post-humanism in continental philosophy must itself be historicized. So like, after the saturation of deconstructionism and Derridian influences in literary theory, then the saturation of all this Deleuzian theory, even cybernetic Deleuzian theory, new materialism, yada, 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 it seems like some continental philosophers or continentally influenced philosophers have nowhere to go besides this lane. So I don't try to conceive this phenomenon as like as something coherent in and of itself, but like maybe this is like the end point of a certain inherent problem in academia.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think it's crucial to understand the historical context. There's a social and historical context under which this kind of move to the post-human becomes, yeah, I mean, visible. And I think, yeah, and it's part of what I was trying to do was kind of, I mean, at least part of what I was trying to do was trying to kind of point out the kind of I guess the genealogy of, like, what philosophical moves or what philosophical kind of presuppositions kind of, determine or orient this kind of predilection for the post-human. And it's, in that regard, it cannot but be political as well. You have to understand it as kind of, another thing is that it's, I mean, I don't want to kind of, overstate this point, but it has a remarkable currency. Okay, this discourse has a remarkable kind of currency within academia, but also, interestingly enough, beyond academia, in the kind of the domain of art and culture, kind of more generally. And that's, I think, significant, and that's, has to be kind of addressed.
I guess one thing I would just like to say, as I say, I found overall your argument in the first half of this essay quite convincing, but in this treatment of Raidotti, where you say that she's missing this, so this notion that indigenous, feminist, queer, disabled people, otherwise enabled, it says here, right? So this notion that these categories have been sort of acknowledged by capitalism, and that's a sort of work in progress, I think it's true. It's definitely true that there is this acknowledgement which is being attempted. I suppose the kind of thing I would flag up there is how successful we can ever expect this to be, like whether there ever will be a full incorporation and a full recognition of Black people or transgender people or whatever, or whether this is going to be the historical basis for continual, whether what I'm trying to say is the dehumanization people in those categories face provides a historical and a continual replenishment for sort of questioning of this avenue. So, like, how can we have categories which are continuously dehumanized and not run into this same set of problems, the same set of back and forths between, well, at what point your dehumanization sort of interrupts or makes impossible forging yourself humanism. And also, one thing I think that's worth mentioning here is that obviously this is something which earlier humanistic anti-colonial thinkers, most obviously Fanon, have sort of been struggling with, exactly this point. So exactly the humanism of people within these categories is sort of running into this problem in much the same way that the anti-humanism is trying to resolve. I'm not satisfied with that attempted resolution, but I can see how these are two sides in sort of communion.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Obviously, I would say, I mean, obviously the point is not to kind of to dismiss, the injustices, perpetrated against these people, but simply to say that there's a way in which, in a way, simply, there's a way of kind of, there's a merely discursive integration, so to speak. In other words, you introduce them at a discursive level, as the recognition kind of is kind of discursive and purely instrumentalized and does nothing to undermine the social relations which necessitates exclusion, not just exclusion, but kind of, destruction, of people, of all sorts of people. So the point is simply, you know, those categories are the ones used by Braidotti herself, you know, and the point is that if you don't destroy capitalist social relations, of course, capital can always kind of include, you know, and represents, you know, can become more inclusive and more representative, but only, you know, by systematically excluding, you know, some, you know, more and more people from from the sphere of culture. And the other point is that, you know, well, you know, it's the cynicism of, there's a, you know, a very good piece by, you know, a kind of an African-American philosopher who points out that, you know, if these debates about inclusion and privilege and representation only unfold within actually existing kind of capitalist institutions, then what remains uninterrogated, again, are the social relations whereby, you know, whole, you know, swathes of the population, of the global population, are necessarily kind of, you know, excluded from those spaces. And that exclusion is based on class, okay, or based on a structural, class as a structural category about, you know, the reduction to labor power. Not as, class is not a sociological category, it is a structural category. So it has nothing to do with, like, you know, what you look like, you know, with your, you know, your appetites, your speech patterns, how you dress, etc. And I guess that's what is, in a way, the ontologizing of capitalism, or the metaphysics of capital, makes it seem as if capitalism itself just operates, again, the point at the level of codes, okay, as if it's just about, you know, coding and decoding. And as if representation itself is only the problem. But if you just kind of, if you can kind of get rid of representation, then you can, you know, solve the problem. Whereas the problem is that the oppression and exploitation operates independently of the machinery of representation and cannot be amended if you remain simply by kind of, you know, through a cosmetic, you know, subversion or kind of enlargement of representation. Okay, there's a comment here, a question here from Virgilio Rivas. Don't you think exchange makes the commodity acquire at least a partial social character? The other part is labor. In this sense, exchange is a social abstraction. We can relate this point to commodity fetishism. For Marx, fetishism lies in the commodity itself, which is derivative of labor. Therefore, fetishism has an objective character. But also at the same time, fetishism obscures the sociality of the commodity through exchange, in the sense that the materiality of the commodity is lost in it. My question here is, don't you think it is in exchange that social abstraction really occurs? I mean, it is in exchange that commodity becomes an irreducible inconsistency. And we need this framework, if only not to reduce commodity to a classical correspondence between labor and the product of labor. The problem here is you can't measure labor time through this correspondence. Okay, again, this is a complicated question. Well, I completely agree that fetishism lies in the commodity. And fetishism is a relation amongst commodities, and not just, you know, commodity fetishism is an objective structure, and not just, you know, a subjective misrepresentation of an objective structure. So I completely agree. But also fetishism obscures the sociality of the commodity through exchange, in the sense that the materiality of the commodity is lost in it. I'm not sure what you mean here when you say that the materiality of the commodity is lost in exchange, because, can you say more actually about what you mean here, Virgilio?
I think it's very clear in Marx that the materiality of commodity itself dissolves into exchange, such that you can make out of any useful value of the commodity itself. And so that's my understanding why exchange becomes an irreducible inconsistency.
Okay, but doesn't Marx also say that not an atom of matter enters into the exchange value of the commodity? And it's, for instance, if you think of commodities like software, it's hard to say what would be, or a program or a software, what is the materiality of the, I know what the use value, and I know what the useful qualities and properties of a commodity would be, but I'm not sure in what sense, they can be, I'm not sure what material, in what sense commodities are material, as opposed to, in what sense material as an adjective is kind of, it can't be usefully contrasted to ideal, because to say that that commodity is a sensible, super sensible thing, is to say that its exchangeability and its usefulness are interdependent. And its usefulness can't be simply abstracted from its exchangeability and juxtaposed to it. And its usefulness is not simply a function of its kind of evident material properties. It possesses independently of its commodity form. So that's why, I guess that's why I don't believe, I think it's because the commodity form is already, a commodity is already a real abstraction. So I think real abstraction is already the condition of commodity exchange and not its consequence.
Yeah, Marx was, actually, Marx gave us an example like 20 linens equal to one coat. Oh, now that's the very materiality of the coat, but the coat itself gets lost into exchange, especially when you put a price into it. And the coat itself is becomes a social abstraction the moment it enters exchange. Well, that's my understanding. Forgive me.
No, well, that point, but doesn't he say it's the body of the coat? When he's talking about the relationship between the linen, the 20 yards of linen and the coat, he says in the simple form of exchange, he says it's the, the body of one commodity embodies the, the abstract, the exchange value of the other. So the use value of one commodity, the use value of the coat, comes to embody the exchange value of the linen. And that's why what he's talking about, kind of equivalence kind of value. And he's talking about the asymmetry. Every commodity, a commodity can only express its value in another commodity. Okay, and in this relation, it's the, the body of, the equivalent is what expresses, the value of the first commodity. So in a way, it's the body, the material qualities of the coat represent or embody, the abstract value of the linen. But the point is that it's not, he uses the term body, I think, not matter. And I think it's important because he says value is necessarily embodied in a commodity But all commodities are necessarily kind of related to one another. So in order for a commodity to, in order for the use value of a commodity to embody the exchange value of another, it turns out that there's a whole, what he calls the expanded and the general form of value are already kind of implicated in this kind of this relation, which is why the money form is already the precondition of the exchange relation, and can't be, as I understand his analysis of the commodity form in the first chapter, it's precisely that it's a structural analysis and not some kind of historical kind of or developmental analysis. And if it's a structural analysis, it means that use and exchange stand to one another in this kind of relationship of, reciprocal presupposition. So that's, the point is that the conditions under which something is useful presuppose, a nexus of social relations, which is to say that there is no such thing as use value in itself. You can't abstract use value from the totality of social relations which bind commodities to one another. And it's in that sense that commodity, as you yourself put it, that's why commodity fetishism is entirely objective. Commodities represent, a commodity represents the usefulness of one commodity, represents the exchangeability of another commodity. And that is a kind of an objective structural properties of commodities, not simply of a representation of commodities.
Just a second
Thank you.
because I think this is interesting, because I'm still thinking since I think, sorry if I butchered this, Ege Choban and Jules Socket.
That was perfect, actually.
Thank you. We're talking about this historization of post-humanism. Yes. I think exactly this notion of commodities here is crucial, because what we do have in commodity exchange is this reduction to formal equality, which I think it's this post-humanist, they put a finger on a symptom. This notion, the notion of formal equality itself, that in an exchange you do have two commodities that enter this relation of being formally equivalent, have this, which then in the political realm expresses itself in this notion of the free subject, that people, that this formal notion of equality that you have in the law system, for example. Lukács talks about this very well. The problem that you do have is this: what posthumanism do is, instead of extending, this kind of qualitative difference that they are looking for, this incomparability that they are looking for, they just extend a notion of formal equality on all that there is, without understanding exactly the notion, this very distinction between a use value and an exchange value, for example. So they extend, ontology is based on missing this fundamental difference of something being the sphere of exchange or something in the sphere of use. Look at being and time between Zuhannenheit, Vorhandenheit in Heidegger. So extending the notion of formal equality in the realm of ontology means exactly this exchange, that you commodify in the end the whole world.
Exactly, and it's really interesting how they try to jump from this to a politics of ecology as well, and that, like, imagine like commodifying the whole world in the context of this politics of ecology as well.
Yes, the counterpart of this is, in a certain sense, when you talk about different forms of discrimination, domination that exists, in you know, the gender or race and all this kind of stuff. The problem is that the moment when you have this reaction against formal equality, it means exactly this battle for recognition, who deserves more, who deserves less, and you know how you split the pie. The problem there is that you should talk about the pie itself. The pie is the problem. And yeah, it's a critique of the pie. It's about a critique of the pie, of this kind of policy of recognition, a pie that sadly tends always to get smaller in a kind of neoliberalism. And I do understand this this drive to go beyond formal equality, go beyond formal representation, but it goes in this kind of mystifying it, and it either both extended it on the whole world by not seeing, by thinking that you are imposing on the world a qualitative difference, and then supposing that there is this kind of qualitative difference where you try to impinge use value on the world again, a use value that is way gone for 200 years. And yes, doing politics of recognition, which I think it's always a problem. Sorry about this.
I think you should write an article called "Critique of the Pie."
Critique of the Pie.
That would be a great, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Do you want to stop the session? We are almost at 3 hours. We can go on if you're okay with it.
I'm afraid, yeah, I have to stop. I'm afraid I have
Yes.
to head home.
Yes. Okay.
But
Thank you.
Thank
you so much. Thank you so much.
I've really appreciated this a lot. This was really helpful. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Thanks for
Thanks
staying
for the
long enough,
questions.
answering all the questions. Yes.
Thanks for the questions. No, it was it's actually, you know, really helpful. But yeah, I'm afraid I really have to go now. So
yeah, thank you so much. See you
okay.
guys next week.
Till
We're
next
gonna,
time.
yeah.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Bye.